Hello, I'm Elaine Clark, Chief Executive of the Rail Forum, and welcome to the third of our Rail Safety Week 2025 podcasts. Today we are going to be joined by Laura Shoaf, who is Chair of Shadow Great British Railways, and we're going to be talking about the really important issue of violence towards women and girls. If you missed our previous episodes, the first featured Andrew Haynes, Chief Executive of Network Rail, talking to Will Rogers, who is Rail Forum Chair and Managing Director of East Midlands Railway, and they had a really broad discussion around health and safety generally on the railway. The second episode featured Richard Clinic, who is Editor of Modern Railways, talking to Laura May, one of our engagement managers, about the important subject of mental health. And both of those podcasts are still available to listen to. Laura, this podcast came about, I think, partly due to a chance conversation that you and I had walking around a factory in Derby. And you mentioned violence towards women and girls and what could we do more about the subject. And it came across to me straight away that this was really important to you personally. So I thought perhaps you could start us off by perhaps sharing with our listeners a little bit about why it is so important to you and your experience of this issue in your career to date.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today. And this is an incredibly important issue. It's an important issue nationally, but it is also really important to me personally. In 2021, myself and my colleague Anne Shaw, we were asked to be national transport champions and to look at the issue of violence against women and girls on public transport, so wider than rail, but across public transport. And as we undertook that work, it was absolutely astounding to me how many people wanted to participate in the work, how many groups of people were looking at this, how important public transport is to women, and why it is absolutely an imperative to make sure that our networks are safer for women and girls. We published our recommendations in 2022, and as a very impatient person, I would say I think change needs to still happen faster. And so part of the reason I think I was asked to chair Shadow GBR was this experience and thinking about what passengers need in terms of safety, and why it is so important for especially the railway to make sure that it is a safe place for women and girls, but for all passengers to travel. So it's a personal and a professional interest of mine, and I'm really keen to make sure that we are able to make as much change as we possibly can.
And whilst we're focusing on that violence against women and girls, it's equally important to men, isn't it? Because whether it's their partners, their daughters, their sisters, it impacts all of us. So when I was doing a little bit of research for today, I saw that the National Police Chiefs Council had described the issue as a national emergency, which are quite strong words. And I'll be honest, I have no feel at all for the scale of the challenge or the scale of the issue. How bad is it? What's going on that we don't sometimes see around us?
So this is a really alarming statistic, but there are currently 3,000 offenses against women and girls, violent offenses recorded every single day, and that is 1 in every 12 women. So if you aren't a woman who has been directly affected by violence against women and girls, then you will definitely interact with somebody every day who has, whether you know it or not. So that is the sort of scale of the challenge of the problem that we are trying to address. And the statistics tell us that it's getting worse. And I'm sure we'll come on to talk about data and how we record data because it's really important. But it's hard at the moment to disaggregate whether more people are reporting crimes, which is a very, very good thing, something we absolutely want to see, is more people feeling they can trust the system to report crimes against them, or if we are seeing crimes increase. And one of the challenges, and it's one of the recommendations that we made in the report, is to think about how we improve the collection, especially of gender disaggregated data, and how we make sure that data is being collected in the same way so that it can be measured. So we're absolutely sure that the numbers are going up, but we don't yet have enough really robust data to tell us if that is both an increase in violence, but also an increase in reporting, or if it's an increase in reporting but different. So we know the scale of the problem is big and getting bigger.
And those numbers are staggering. I'm just going to repeat them for the benefit of our listeners. 3,000 incidents every single day, and 1 in 12 people. That is almost 10% of our female population that is travelling that has had some sort of experience.
And that's not just on the network. That is just violence in general. But that is it. They are two sides of the same coin, if that makes sense. And we also know that women statistically use public transport more than men, and they're certainly more reliant on it in order to get to jobs and to education. And so, again, it will have a disproportionate impact because there are more women using public transport than men.
You raise a really good point about why women use public transport, why all of us use public transport. So the impact that having a negative experience can really influence people's education, their ability or confidence to get to work or visit family. So lots and lots of really important reasons beyond the obvious, this just should not be happening, beyond that obvious that makes it really important. But you mentioned data, and I was really sort of keen to try to understand and help our listeners to understand what do we know in terms of some of the occurrences. Is it mainly a nighttime issue, or is it across the whole day that women have these issues? Are there specific hotspots or locations or days of the week? Do we have any information at all at this stage?
I don't think we have the kind of reliable comparative information that we need, although there is ongoing at the moment a very large customer survey, one of the first of its kind, and it is asking some questions about this, and it will be able to apply some geolocators to where we see that happening. But part of the problem, without going into the sort of minutia of it, is where it's recorded. If you're on a vehicle or on a train moving between two places, where is that incident actually recorded? Is it the station that you arrive at? Is it the station that you left from? So again, is it the route? So there's just some inconsistencies, but there's some really good work going on across the industry to try to get to that kind of consistency. So from players across the whole of the industry, so that we can also understand where we are trying to make changes. Body-worn cameras, for example, where staff are wearing those and recording, is that making a difference? So again, it's not just the data, but it's measuring it in the same way. And the industry has, as I said, has really come together on this. And I was at a conference, I think it was RDG that hosted, and there were a number of speakers who had been victims of violence. And one of the things that they said was that they didn't ever want to get on public transport again. And it wasn't really mode specific, to be fair. It was a perception that they wouldn't be safe on any mode. So it matters not just for rail, it matters for bus, it matters for tram, it matters for the walking between stations and cars, it's the whole end-to-end journey. And so it's a problem for every mode, but it's also a problem for the end-to-end journey. And when we did the work, we also looked at infrastructure and how we design infrastructure. And unfortunately, we're still really bad in terms of gender balance in the transport industry, from people who design infrastructure to people who implement it. And so again, being able to be more representative as an industry will go some way to helping to address this issue as well. I think that's also quite a big challenge.
I've often wondered who designed the location of the ladies' toilets at Birmingham New Street Station. They are not in necessarily the most obvious place. the very far corner is perhaps not the best design. So I absolutely concur with your comments on some of that design. It's really important. And I know someone who works in the railway, and I was talking to her about the subject as part of the preparation for today. And her comment was she feels unsafe when she gets off the train walking from the station to her car. So what you've said about it's that whole journey, it's about all the modes of transport. And again, some of your background, both from a West Midlands Combined Authority and Urban Transport Group perspective, really plays into that, doesn't it, in terms of we have to think about the whole journey for our passengers and every aspect of that, including the safety. So what can we do about it? So from a Rail Forum perspective, obviously we represent the supply chain, but we feel that we have a really important role towards the wider railway because we're part of that railway family. What can we do? What can our supply chain do? What can the industry do? What can we as individuals do to try to help?
If we go back to that horrendous statistic that 1 in 12 women have been affected by this, one thing everybody can do is ask and bring it to the forefront of mind. So no matter what bit of the railway that you're working on, whether it's through the supply chain through to the operation, to challenge yourself, to talk to colleagues about whether or not that looks and feels safe. Is this something that you would use? What do you see that I don't see? And even just acknowledging that is really important. I'm always challenging the industry as well because we talk all the time about how safe trains are in this country. But when we talk about safety, we're talking about having incidents on the railway. We're not talking about personal safety. So I try to use that as a way to challenge as well, just to say, well, hang on, what do you mean when you say the railway is safe? Do you think it's safe for passengers? Is every aspect of the railway safe? Or because I think, again, it's just changing that mindset to think about what we mean when we talk about it being safe. I don't know, does it feel safe to you to use the railway? Does it feel safe to your daughter? Thinking about other things that really matter. Again, what we measure really matters. In the West Midlands, for example, we were absolutely diligent about never cancelling the last tram. And that's something I think the industry needs to look at, never cancelling the last train. That actually puts people in an incredibly dangerous situation. Why don't we measure how many last trains are cancelled up and down this country and where they are? What does that do to passengers, all passengers, who now can't get back to where they need to go because they're stranded somewhere? And in big cities, you might have an option to take a taxi or an Uber, but in rural areas, the options for people are really limited. But some of these really important things that measure passenger safety aren't necessarily measured. Now, the Secretary of State has asked Shadow GBR to look at what we measure. And we are looking, and again, through this rail survey, to try to have a much better understanding of that issue. I did also some immersive learning at that conference. It was fascinating. There was a VR headset that we were all tasked to use. And it talked about how you can, it showed examples of what people can do to get in between an awkward situation. So, for example, they showed a young woman moving seats because she was uncomfortable where she was sat, and then that person moving as well to sit on the other side of that. And what as a bystander you can do. Now, some people just look at that and don't do anything. But having done that immersive learning myself, I would now move to sit next to them or ask if they wanted to trade seats with me. And there are some really practical things that people can do in order to respond to what they see. Some of this is a bigger cause and effect, and I'm not suggesting for a second that the rail industry can fix the problem. And it's a huge cross-government initiative as well, with the Home Office in the lead. But I think challenging ourselves to look, to be aware, to try to think about what you're seeing, to try to diffuse situations where possible in a way that is non-confrontational. Thinking about how we treat the women who work on the railways themselves as well, making the workplace safe for women. That's one really basic step into then thinking about how it's safe for passengers. But if it's not necessarily safe for the women that work on that culture of safety has got to start there and to come through. And then again, as you would look at something around accessibility, does it meet the needs of accessibility? There should be some certain standards, I would suggest, about looking at where you might put the facilities in a train station, or whether the lighting between a station and a car park is adequate, and whether there is CCTV, and whether there's a presence there. And then when we get that data, being able to really look at hotspots where we have activity, and then think about what we're going to do differently. So one of the initiatives that we did in the West Midlands, which I was really proud of, was we had a joint force between British Transport Police, West Midlands Police, and the Combined Authority and Transport for West Midlands to provide additional people out on our network, because safety was so important to us. And we would work with all of the operators, including train, to target and pinpoint where we had reports of antisocial behavior, or certain times of day, certain bus routes or train routes or tram routes where we knew locally that we would have bad behavior, and then putting additional resource out and a visible presence. And people talk a lot about how reassured they are when they feel seen, and when there is a visible presence. So we need to think about sort of all those things. And I think I've not met anybody who says they don't want to make transport safer. I mean, nobody says that. So I think it's just challenging people to think about what their role is in that, and what role they play. And they may think it's small, but it will make a difference.
And I think what I take away from that is that none of what you've described is hugely expensive. It's not tens of thousands, millions of pounds worth of investment. The investment in certain areas is important, but it's about what we can all do as human beings, to be fair, and being aware of not just yourself, but other people around you in different circumstances. But there's also something around what different regions, different parts of the country can learn from perhaps the West Midlands example. Are we doing enough to share that good practice, Laura, or is there more that you think we could do?
No matter where you are in this country, there is a problem on public transport. So it is something that the Urban Transport Group looks at and spends a lot of time sharing good practice. Again, the report that we published in 2022 pulls out a lot of really good practice that's happening up and down the country. And I know a lot of mayors are really passionate about this, again, because there's an impact on human beings. But again, as I said, more women use public transport. There's a huge repercussion to the economy and to the future economic prospects or learning prospects of women and girls, that we also ought to care about equally. So we're in areas where we have transport poverty, defined as people not having access to an automobile. People are entirely dependent on public transport in order to move throughout their conurbation, and it should just be completely unacceptable that is then an unsafe situation to put them in.
You mentioned a conference that ODG had run earlier in the year. Am I right in thinking there were a number of commitments that came from that conference that the industry sort of has adopted? Are you able to tell us a little bit more about some of those commitments and how they're progressing?
Yeah, absolutely. So there were a list of actions that come from the event, and RDG has been working on some of the priority elements of that. So training packages, that lived experience that I talked about, the ability to give people some of the tools to learn how to do that. Identifying and designating safe spaces on station estates for victims was one of those. Visible leadership across government was another. And again, leadership in this space from the department is at the most senior level, which is great. And there's a team of people in this department working on it. We're trying to promote the use of body-worn cameras and other safety tools. Obviously up to people whether they choose to use them or turn them on, but there's quite a lot of evidence to say it's of benefit both to the staff, but also to the passenger. Thinking about how we work with unions to build trust and around training and the use of some of those tools. Again, embedding core organizational objectives. So that bit about safety being part of performance and part of what is measured in terms of how we evaluate how well we are doing. And then thinking about workplace intervention plans. Some of these are more difficult. One of the things that we also recommended was more effective training across the industry about how we help manage the events when they happen. And another thing that we had talked about in our recommendations, so separate to the RDG conference, but actually reviewing our safeguarding practices and DBS checks and thinking about what we do about front-facing staff across the whole of the transport industry. So there's a lot to go at, and there's a lot to do.
And you also picked up on a point there which we haven't really talked about, which is this isn't just about the safety of our female passengers, it's also our female staff. And that's easy to forget sometimes because they're there, we take them for granted like we take all of our colleagues for granted. There's lots to go at here, Laura, and I'm conscious we have not got that much time. I knew it was going to be a fascinating conversation for all the right reasons, which is really trying to get us to think about something that is so important, but sometimes a little bit hidden and don't always want to talk about these difficult subjects. So before we start to wrap up, are there any other key messages that you'd like to get across to our listeners around how we can help, or whether it's helping you in your role, whether it's just generally, or any other key bits of data that you want to share with our listeners? Any sort of key messages from you?
I would just say we have a very serious problem that is getting worse. There is a role that everybody can play, no matter what bit of the industry that you work in. Challenge yourself to think all the way through the problem. Is there a change that we could make that would actually somehow help improve? And again, I'm particularly focused on women and girls, but safety for everybody who is using this network. Technology, how we're going to channel and harness technology. For people in the supply chain, there must be thousands of good ideas out there. Make those suggestions known and challenge yourself and wherever you work to think about, could we make a small change? Could we see if that makes a big difference? And then talk to passengers, talk to users. What could we be doing? Is there anything we could be doing better? And then as a member of society, trying to, where best you can in your role to intervene when you see something that doesn't look or seem right. I think a lot of it happens unnoticed or under noses. And, again, we come back to designing infrastructure, but there are a lot of places where it's really hard to see what's happening. The train layouts are different, aren't they? So it's not always that it can be witnessed. But if you keep it in the front of your mind and you try to be a good citizen to others, and then think about how you would feel if you were in that same situation or that was somebody that you knew or loved, and then where it's safe and appropriate to try to make that intervention.
I think two things there for me, really. The first, which is, what can you do? Think about what you can really do. That good citizen piece. And then from a supply chain perspective, what can the supply chain do to help in terms of ideas, innovations? So there's very much your call to action, which is do your bit, do keep your eyes and ears open. And I guess if you're uncomfortable getting involved yourself, talk to a member of staff. British Transport Police, we know, are also there to very much to help. So just don't do nothing, as it were, but then also bring your ideas and technological solutions or whatever that can also help with the problem. I would just like to say thank you so much for your time. I know you are incredibly busy. You have an enormous role, enormous challenge to help the industry move forward, not just on this area and on this issue, but generally. But I think what you have done today is really shine a light on not just something that's so important to half the population and actually all the population because of what we said earlier in terms of our male colleagues that have female relatives, but really just bringing those sorts of subjects that we don't like to talk about or that we're uncomfortable talking about into the spotlight and really giving us some hard facts, some hard data and asking us to take a long, hard look at what's happening out there and all of us helping to improve the situation. So massive thank you to you, Laura, for your time. And hopefully next time we talk, the data will be a little bit more positive.
Absolutely. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.